Imagine if one of the largest experiments in human history happened without most people realizing it. Not a drug, not a medical treatment, not a new technology. Food. Over the last century, many of the fruits and vegetables we eat have changed dramatically. Modern strawberries are often much larger than their historical ancestors. Modern apples are generally sweeter. Modern bananas look almost nothing like the wild varieties they came from. And most of us never stop to think about it. We simply walk into a grocery store, fill our carts, and assume these foods have always looked this way. But they haven't. And that raises a fascinating question. When we changed our food, did anyone actually study the consequences? At first, I assumed the answer would be simple. Surely researchers would have investigated something this important. Surely there would be decades of studies comparing the foods our grandparents ate to the foods we eat today. Surely someone would have wanted to know whether larger, sweeter, higher yielding fruits and vegetables affected the people consuming them. But the deeper I looked, the more complicated the story became. Welcome back to Carnivore found me researching how modern food changed us. Today's facts can be tomorrow's fallacies, and sometimes the most interesting discoveries aren't found in the answers. They're found in the questions nobody thought to ask. To understand why this matters, we first need to understand how dramatically our food has changed. Long before genetic engineering existed, humans were already redesigning plants. Wild bananas contained large hard seeds. Wild strawberries were tiny compared to modern varieties. Historical watermelons look dramatically different from the watermelons found in grocery stores today. Generation after generation, farmers selected plants with traits they preferred. Larger fruit, better color, improved flavor, greater yields, longer shelf life. The process wasn't mysterious. It was practical. If one plant produced fruit that sold better, its seeds were saved. If another plant survived transportation more effectively, its genetics became more common. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century, the food supply slowly transformed. And eventually, many of the foods we eat today became almost unrecognizable compared to their ancestors. Now, some people hear this and immediately think about GMOs. But that's not actually where most of these changes came from. Many of the most dramatic transformations happened through selective breeding and hybridization, long before modern genetic engineering entered the picture. And that's an important distinction, because the question isn't whether food changed. That's well documented. The question is something much more interesting. What happened after it changed? And this is where things start getting complicated, because researchers have spent decades studying nutrition, food safety, population health, and agricultural productivity. But when it comes to comparing historical foods directly with their modern counterparts, the evidence becomes surprisingly difficult to find. One area researchers have explored is something called the dilution effect. The idea is fairly simple. If a plant becomes larger or grows faster, its nutrient content may not increase at exactly the same rate as its size. Imagine pouring the same amount of mineral content into a much larger tomato. The concentration could potentially change. Some researchers have reported declines in certain nutrients and minerals across specific fruits and vegetables over time. Others argue the findings vary considerably depending on the crop, the nutrient being measured, and the time period being examined. In other words, the evidence isn't entirely one-sided. But that's what makes the discussion interesting, because the debate isn't necessarily about whether fruits and vegetables became unhealthy. The debate is about whether they became different. And those are not the same thing. Good science often begins with a simple observation. Something changed. The next step is figuring out what that change actually means. And this is where another question enters the picture. Sweetness, because size isn't the only trait breeders selected for. Consumers tend to like sweet fruit. Sweet fruit sells. Sweet fruit gets purchased again and again. So over time, many fruits became sweeter than the varieties that existed generations ago. Apples, strawberries, grapes, and many others, which leads to an obvious question. Does that matter? Most population research continues to associate fruit consumption with positive health outcomes. That's an important point, but it doesn't fully answer another question. What if someone wanted to compare modern fruit directly to historical fruit? What if researchers wanted to know whether the changes themselves mattered? And this is where I ran into something unexpected. The study I expected to find may not actually exist. So, did anyone study the consequences? The honest answer is partially. Researchers studied what they thought mattered. Agricultural scientists studied what helped farmers. Food scientists studied what helped manufacturers. Nutrition researchers studied what they could get funded. But a comprehensive, long-term investigation into whether selectively breeding fruits and vegetables for size, sweetness, and yield changed how they interact with human metabolism, that specific study remains unfunded, unpublished, and largely unasked. Not because it's not important, but because nobody thought to ask it until now. Good health leaves clues. And one of the most powerful clues is simply paying attention to what hasn't been studied. In our next investigation, we're going to look at something even more overlooked than modern fruit. We're going to look at what happened when we changed animal foods. Because if you think the changes to strawberries and apples were dramatic, wait until you see what happened to the meat, eggs, and dairy your grandparents ate compared to what's in grocery stores today. Success leaves clues. And sometimes the biggest clues are found in the questions that make people uncomfortable. If this video made you think differently about the food in your grocery cart, do 3 things right now. First, hit that like button. It tells YouTube that curious, thoughtful documentaries deserve to be seen. Second, comment below. Here's my question for you. What food do you suspect has changed the most that nobody talks about? I read every single comment, and your answers might become our next investigation. Third, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're just getting started researching how modern food changed us. Be the CEO of your own health, because the food industry isn't going to ask these questions for you. Researching how modern food changed us. I'm your host, and I'll see you in the next investigation.